Welcome everyone to our webinar today. This is Designing Effective Procurement Models for Decarbonization. And we have an amazing group of panelists to join us today. And we're going to be looking at all sorts of variations of aspects of procurement models. We're going to be including setting goals, key principles, as well as alternative financing methods for procurement models. We are pleased to be partnered with CHES and funded in part by Government of Canada through the IRF program, with technical direction from EnerLife Consulting, and Greening Healthcare is a program of the Climate Challenge Network. Some quick housekeeping. If you would like to join in the discussion, please use Q&A to submit your questions and try to avoid using the chat. That way we'll have a record and we can follow up if we're not able to answer any of them live. And this webinar is recorded, and a posting of this as well as the slides will be on our Greening Healthcare website on the event page within probably the next day or two. As always, a huge thank you to our program sponsors. We really appreciate your support and technical advice you provide to the program throughout the year. Great to be working with you again this year. And your webinar hosts for today include the usual suspects here of Ian Jarvis, Deep Deal, and Michael Pagel, myself. And with that, we'll go to the land acknowledgement for Ian. Do you want to give that?
Yeah, good morning to a remarkable number of registrants we have from the West today. And good afternoon to everybody else on both sides of the border in Eastern North America. As with all Climate Challenge Network events, we do always begin with a land acknowledgement, acknowledging respectfully the ancestral and unceded territory of the Inuit, the Métis, and the First Nations people that we share these lands with today. We're meeting today on a virtual platform from Toronto in Ontario, where I'm speaking from the traditional homes of the Huron-Wendat, the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, and the Mississaugas of the Credit River. And you may know that Toronto and areas to the north and down to the islands in Toronto are subject to Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit River. And as always, Greening Healthcare, we trust and hope that the work we're doing today and that you're doing, you wouldn't be on this call if you weren't part of this, this work is contributing in a meaningful way to our common responsibility as stewards of the environment. Next slide, please. Our agenda, first we wanted to put boundaries around what we're going to try to get into today. There's so many aspects to how we actually turn the idea of decarbonization of the energy transition into reality within individual hospitals. So we'll talk a bit about the scope of what we're trying to do, and everything both within existing facilities and with new hospitals that are being envisaged and prepared for. Setting goals is everything. If you set the right energy target, history shows that you get there. If you don't set the right energy target, you get wherever you end up. So targets are fundamentally important to making real progress with respect to climate change mitigation. And I think in the last 2 or 3 years, we've had some really important conversations about how do you bring the dynamics together for a successful relationship. So accountability, we talk about pain share and gain share, but the most effective hospitals, most efficient hospitals we see have the best working relationships between the hospitals and the contractors, whether again it's existing or new. How do you weigh experience? How do you weigh innovation when you're trying to procure these things? So we really want to get into the principles, what we're trying to accomplish through procurement, and we want to look at this for new hospitals and for the major works that are happening and will happen with existing hospital facilities as they manage their way through the energy transition. And finally, we have a bit of an ad hoc working group of experienced hospital executives we're working with around project financing. Money is tight these days. We were chatting with BC yesterday. We've had a lot of conversations in Ontario In the United States, the cuts to Medicaid are having major impacts on the budgets of hospitals. Money is tight. So what are the practical options for funding the work that needs to be done, from relatively small expenditures that we need to somehow find out of tight operating budgets, all the way to investment in the long-term sustainability of healthcare facilities? So those are the two primary areas, the relationships and financing options, that Amandeep will be exploring with our panelists a bit later. So let's step into the scoping part, and there's always takeaways that we hope people will all take back to their organizations, but there's a couple of guiding principles here. The first is the energy. This is the biggest transition in human history. We've looked at it. We're quite sure that times were challenging as we moved from the Stone Age to the Iron Age, but none of us can remember back that far. The previous energy transition was at the turn of the 20th century, where we went from wind and animal power and wood to hydrocarbons. Now we have to transition back away from hydrocarbons. Transitioning to them was easy. Transitioning away from them now, with 8 billion people on the planet, is devilishly hard. So the energy transition is requiring fundamental change, which means we have to rethink every aspect of what we do and how we do it, whoever we are, whatever organization we're in, and nowhere more so than hospitals. So we're in a time of profound change, is important principle number one. Second principle is that capital projects are no longer predominantly like-for-like replacements. That as we look at capital projects now, everyone has to be viewed through the lens of the low-carbon future. And it's a material opportunity, if you like, a generational opportunity to take a step forward towards that low-carbon future. And everything should be around what is the low-carbon alternative to like-for-like replacements. If anybody's planning replacing their steam boiler plant in the next 5 years, rethink it now. This is the time to kind of rethink it now. So with those guiding principles, with new hospitals, and you'll see it's the same first bullet for both, setting the right energy target is everything. Humber River success came from their bravery in setting a target that no hospital had achieved before. And guess what? With the innovation of the contractors and all the players involved, we got there, and it set a new standard, set a new world. Setting the right energy target is critical. Requiring the right technologies is key. And our panelists are going to be talking somewhat about the technologies, zoning, heat recovery chillers, advanced heat recovery. All of these issues are fundamental because they have to be built in for a facility that's going to last 50 to 100 years. And going back to the agenda, there's how do we harmonize the sometimes potentially competing issues around partnership, accountability, and adaptability for the fact this facility is going to be there for a long time. If it's a DBFM contract, keeping it up to date, absorbing, adopting new technologies as they become available and become cost effective is key. And I know a couple of the panelists are going to get into this whole idea of the relative merits of DBF, design build finance, or DBFM, where the maintenance contract is all built into it. There's a trend towards DBF, and that may or may not be beneficial to the future of emissions reduction and sustainability. So new hospitals, we need to dig into that to get it right. For existing hospitals, the same. We're going to talk about targets in just a moment. There's a right energy use level for every hospital out there after you adjust for weather, for combined heat and power, for heating sources, for different space types, whatever it is. You need to know what that is, and we can share that with you. Many hospitals are getting into master planning. Master planning has to have the low carbon, the energy transition lens. Your building condition assessments come every 4 or 5 years. They have to be setting the stage for decarbonization, not just looking to see what's worn out, what's broken. In service contracts, we have spent a lot of time talking to the BAS contractors, to boiler service contractors, about how they can be active partners in this, but not under the kind of contracts we're signing with them right now. So really looking forward to discussion around performance-based service contractors. How can we use the skills and the knowledge of our service contractors to help advance the agenda? So next slide, please. So let's talk a little bit about targets. If you're familiar with greening healthcare, you've heard this before, but just want to refer you to where every hospital on this call has a number, has an energy target, has a target potential savings, potential emissions reductions, utility cost savings, and you can know them. And if you don't know what yours is today, get in touch with us and we're happy to share where you can find that information. But setting the right energy target. This begins with the idea of benchmarking. Again, you've seen these before. Greening healthcare is all about looking at these less intense, energy-intensive hospitals at the top of this chart. Every horizontal line on this chart is a hospital. We've got, I think, 60 or more hospitals on this call. All of you are somewhere on this. And the blue is your electricity use per square foot. The orange is your thermal energy, where most of the emissions are and increasingly will be in future. We found the top performing hospitals in the box in the middle. We spent a lot of time talking with them. But the idea of learning from the best, the hospitals at the top, sharing with the rest, and moving that whole curve to the left is critical. And we know that just running our existing facilities, not major capital investments, just running them efficiently can cut emissions by 30%. We can get 30% of the way to where we're trying to go simply by running existing plant well, and it starts with your energy target. Next slide, please. And it's a big deal. We're looking for the numbers on British Columbia. We have numbers from other jurisdictions across North America, but just looking at Ontario, getting all of the hospitals that are on the wrong side of that quartile, so that are using more energy than what 25% of their peer hospitals, comparable hospitals, are using. We can cut total energy use by 32% just by running those hospitals right. From Ontario taxpayer standpoint, that's $55 million worth of utility costs that right now we're not only wasting, but are being spent to pollute the atmosphere, to accelerate climate change, not slow it down. And that's 140,000 tons of greenhouse gas emissions. This is a big deal. That's a really big number, and we're saying it's attainable, and we're challenging everybody we work with. We can get there by 2030. Hospitals can contribute to meeting the Government of Canada's 2030 emissions reduction targets just by bearing down over the next 5 years and delivering these numbers for each and every individual hospital. Next slide, please. And the idea of the target is your fair share is meeting that top quartile target for your particular hospital type in your climate with your particular heating system configuration. This is just an example report from a real hospital. This hospital has a target, adjusted target for all of the variations on that site of 19.8 kilowatt hours a square foot of electricity, of 43.8 for thermal energy. You add those together at 63.6, and you meet those targets, which again, 25% of hospitals like you out there are already achieving those levels. You meet those targets, we cut energy by 44%, and this is 2,600 tons of that greenhouse gas emissions reduction potential. By your fair share, it means we have a responsibility to do this. It's not optional. It's always good to save $713,000 a year, but the planet needs us to be responsive to our environmental goals, and that 2,600 tons is doable. We know it's doable. We need to get on with it. Next slide, please. And if you're a Greening Healthcare member, you get this annual report every year, which is those numbers. You see that same little table down in the bottom left-hand corner there. You see where your sites are on the ranking, on the benchmarking chart on the left-hand side of the page, and you can see how much progress you made in the previous year. So every Greening Healthcare member you know where you stand. If you can't find the report, the latest report, get back to Michael. He'll be happy to forward it to you. But this is your roadmap. This is your work plan. This, again, with great respect, is your responsibility. Next slide, please. With new hospitals, we published so much work on this. We were with Cliff in Columbus at the ASHE conference earlier this year presenting these findings. The big story here, as you see the National Energy, the National Energy Code number in the top there, the large majority of new hospitals that have opened in the past 10 years in Canada and the United States are substantially less efficient than what current codes are calling for, and in many cases less efficient than the hospitals they've replaced. And we just need to do a better job with new hospitals. So that's going to be part of the conversation later. An ongoing dialogue within greening healthcare. What goes right? What goes wrong? How do we make sure we get this consistently right the first time? Next slide, please. These target numbers, this is what we presented to the ASHE conference. For a new acute care hospital, 100 kP, 1,000 BTUs per square foot, or 30 equivalent kilowatt hours per square foot. This is now bogey. It would not have been without what Humber River did, without what Cordelucci Vaughan did following them, without what's happening with Providence Care in Kingston and Peel Memorial. These hospitals are showing us what can be done. We know how to do it. This is the breakdown. If you have a new hospital under development, this is how you calibrate your energy model to meet these numbers, because anything more than this is just not acceptable. Next slide, please. And you can find those numbers on the Greening Healthcare website. The report in the middle here is the performance metrics that you just saw. And those are being updated on a fairly regular basis, but we published all the information. On the right-hand side is the Humber River story, not just the numbers, the metrics, the systems, the technology, but the story behind the story. Bob Collins, the CEO's account of how did they swim upstream to achieve these kind of outcomes that have changed the game everywhere else. Next slide, please. So with that, hopefully setting the stage of what we're trying to accomplish today and going forward with the ongoing work, let me thank and introduce our panel, then pass it over to Amandeep, who, again, will go through the principles of how you obtain a progressive procurement approach, and then the financing options there. So Cliff Harvey, I think most people on the call will recognize Cliff, previously the work at South Niagara, his whole career working towards better numbers, better outcomes, now working on the very large Waterloo Region U Hospital. Harry Vandermeer, who's been working tirelessly at Alberta Health Services on finding ways to do more with less and to achieve really substantive outcomes in almost 200 hospital facilities with limited resources. You know, the government's not very forthcoming with capital and is long on expectations for improvements. Harry's delivered that consistently, has a lot to share about existing facilities. And Kurt and Smith and Anderson, again, you know Kurt and his work. Kurt's team has been responsible for some of the most energy efficient new hospitals we found, and he's pushing hard on existing hospitals and also the whole framework of codes and regulations and what is the background to achieving these results. So again, thanks to our panelists, and let me pass this over to Amandeep, and let's get on with the questions, Amandeep. And once again, if you have questions from the audience, write them into the Q&A. Don't put them in the chat, because the chat gets lost after this call. The Q&A becomes a permanent record of this call. If they fit within the direction that the discussion is going, which I have no idea what that will be with these panelists, because it'll go where it should and where it will. If we don't get to them during this session, we will respond to them in writing afterwards. So use the Q&A, and please keep your questions coming, and we'll check with Michael periodically on questions to be inserted into the conversation. Amandeep, over to you.
Thanks, Ian. Thanks, everyone, for joining this afternoon and this morning. Just a heads up, we had some technical issues and trying to still get Harry on the line. So if you wonder where Harry is, we're still working through that technical issue. Thanks everyone again, and thanks Cliff and Kurt to be part of and Harry be part of this discussion. So let me start with the Cliff with you first, and we'll talk about take a couple of questions on first on the new hospitals procurement side, and then we'll move on to the existing hospital side. So you have been part of this network for years. I mean, your role has been with ministry where you have sort of seen a lot of these hospitals come through. Then you moved on to see how, I mean, kind of design and operate some of these hospitals. And then in the last decade, you have been sort of leading front at creating a vision for these hospitals to see how they're going to be delivered. Your recent sort of experiences with this and development of these hospitals. How do you put a vision together for these hospitals so on the procurement side, you get the best outcome for these new hospitals? And part of that is because your vision for these hospitals includes a lot of other details, then energy and emissions is part of that, but it's still very centric to how it's get delivered. It eventually plays a major roles in hospital operating principles. So how do you ensure that that becomes sort of at the center stage of every sort of aspect of the project? And how do you make sure for your sort of the two hospitals that you worked on and one you're working on, to sort of create that vision and then put that in the front and continue to put that in the front for the timeline of the projects getting built and delivered?
Great, thank you. A good question, because I think it's fundamentally one of the biggest challenges to on delivering sustainable projects, because if you don't start at the beginning to understand what the problem you're trying to solve, you basically start solving whatever problem you had yesterday. And so one of the things we always do is and I refer to it as having the time and space to do this work. It's early in the earliest stages of planning where you actually put together reports on what you're trying to achieve, what technology you might be interested in. So we do an energy, basically an environmental report that includes energy. So we also set different goals in terms of greenhouse gas reduction, water reduction, how we actually want to use our environment from that perspective, energy being a big component of that. And we start using the work that Greening Healthcare has done to look at what are the models that we should be looking at. And Humber always is the one that Ian refers to. What were some of the technologies, what did they do, and how do we become better from that perspective? We also do a resiliency plan. South Niagara was the first one to do it in Ontario. BC has been doing it for a while. And the idea behind that is it gives us an idea about what we're talking about in the future. So if we're looking at 2080 and we're talking about an increase of temperature of X, Y, or Z, we also have to plan for that. We have to prepare ourselves for it. And the key to this is that you're not doing this while you're trying to design the facility. You're trying to do this while you're planning the facility. Because if you try to do it when you're designing the facility, you don't have the time. And that's where everybody, when you don't have time, everybody falls back into their previous behaviors, and they'll design something that is more traditional. And I'll give you an example of that. Because of the pressure on the system to phase these construction projects, we'll have 3 major buildings on the site, all built within very short period of time of each other. And the first fallback position that our engineers have suggested is a central utility plant. And it was like, it's when you start talking about the technology, you ask, is that the right solution? Sure, that was made sense when order of magnitude, when you try to have the plant all in one place, big boilers and everything else. But when things are getting decentralized, and when you're talking about sterilization, steam production, and stuff like that, does it make sense that you try to put everything into one central plant, or can you actually find the efficiencies within the building? You can only study that at the beginning, because once you get an approval, and at least I'll speak on Ontario, once you have an approval, that whole process drives the project through. If you want to be innovative and do something different, you have to do it at the beginning and set the vision. So.
Thanks, Cliff. That's actually a point to be noted. I think we talked about in the past as well, like how critical it is to set the vision and then have people buy into that vision, because that's where your success is going to be set up. Let me bring Kurt in it. So Kurt, like,
Deep, can I
yeah,
just say one thing? Because this is,
yeah,
I think this is the hurdle that everybody has trouble with. The government only gives you a couple $1 million to plan. And we end up spending that on functional programmers, and we end up spending that on architects to do master planning. We actually have to spend that money on engineers and do these reports. And it is possible, and you get reimbursed for it, and you may have to use some money from the facilities or whatever, but don't let, well, we can't afford it. You can't afford not to do it. So I just got to say, it's something that needs to be contemplated at the beginning from a financial or budgeting point of view. Sorry to cut in there, Kurt.
no,
I think it's important because otherwise you don't get the financial resources to get the other resources on board.
Absolutely. I think that's a critical piece, is the planning of all of the aspects, not just the clinical piece is what kind of determine your success of the projects around operating carbon that you're going to see at the end of the project. Kurt, you've been part of these design teams and led some of these designs that have been high performers in terms of operating carbon, as well as overall performance of these hospitals. The trend that we're seeing, and again, we could even see that trend different. Like, there's been trend to do DBFMs projects, which is design, build, finance, and maintain, where there is some leverage in there in terms of the pain share, gain share mechanism that kind of enforces some of the accountability on the project core delivery team to get you the best performance for these projects. That model may be shifting towards DBFM, where it is becoming even more harder to get the right product in the time. Like, what you have seen so far, and how do you ensure from owner's perspective that they get the best outcome for these models that now doesn't have an M piece attached to it, right? So what sort of specification or goals or targets can they kind of include in their procurement processes so they end up getting a right product in the end? So if you want to sort of maybe provide some of your experiences around managing the expectations around DBFs, and how could somebody procure those models with a better outcome in mind in the end.
And I will say, I mean, it's a good question. I think in the DBFM model, just using energy targets and as that was presented before for various system components and so on and so forth at a high level is generally good enough. You don't have to get too prescriptive. You know, going back 20 years ago, we didn't have that many high performing facilities to look at to understand how could you get there. Now we have studies, we have lots of white papers on it. We understand how to get to those targets. So in the DBFM model, you could set general targets. You could set some general principles. Use lots of shoulds, not shalls, not be as prescriptive, and let the teams work towards hitting those targets and trying to find that in the most cost-effective way as possible, right? Because you want to balance that. You want to maximize your patient care dollars. You want to maximize that money going into patient care while meeting some pretty aggressive targets without being too prescriptive. And what I mean by that is, in some cases, we've seen models where they prescribe, for instance, chiller performance, like the efficiencies of chillers. What you really care about is the overall building target. And so there's a lot of back and forth that you can do. Now, on the DBF model, that is where you start to run into more challenges, because someone else is maintaining the building. The hospital is generally maintaining the building themselves. And at that point, there's a lot of finger pointing that can go back and forth once you start to see those real bills come in about how that building's being operated. So one of the things I would do is I would definitely be looking at a few more prescriptive requirements there, where you bake in and say you do want a lot of things, but commissioning would be absolutely mandatory, but more importantly, building in the trends. So from day one, occupancy schedules, for instance, all have to be programmed in. Those are just basic things that you would do. So there'd be a lot more work upfront during the commissioning stage, and really in the procurement model. And when you're laying that out, ask contractors to detail that side of it out, where they are looking at the performance and you're able to see trends for various pieces of equipment and meter them. The reality is, unfortunately, from the time that you kind of get the hospital up and ready and you're commissioning it, it's not fully occupied. So it never really performs right to that target. But then probably have more check-ins at least 1 year after that, and have them come back and deal with some of those issues. So there's got to be a lot more prescription. The pain share, gain share model is self-correcting to some degree. Panic sets in if they don't hit those targets, if they're not doing all the right things. We've seen it time and time again. And then everyone has laser-like focused on hitting the items that they need to hit those targets. So I would say definitely a baking in period where all those trends that you see on the BAS, the metering that's in place, you're actually being able to monitor those and monitor those for accuracy and have balancers come in and validate that a lot of these systems are operating the way they are, right? Getting those reports and getting those draft reports out of the system that becomes part of a submission process from a fully commissioned hospital is very important. So the users themselves, the facility managers, understand what they're looking at, how to interpret that data, and build in more training time from the design team and the commissioning team with the facility staff. Like that's another critical component, and probably have that spread out over a 3-month to 6-month period, because one thing that we know is that there's also a transition. When you take over new space, you typically are hiring people on, so you might not have the right staff in place, or there would be turnover in that first couple of years for owners to be able to handle that. Just a couple of things to think about in the DBF
Yeah.
model.
I'll bring Cliff and you in 1 second. And I still remember our conversation on value engineering, and I will bring you in on that piece in 1 second. But Kurt, before I sort of go to Cliff on this, um, I just want to make sure like this is kind of absolutely kind of clear, and is maybe there's a part that all of us together, people on the call and the industry, need to kind of set a certain standard around what is good prescriptive things that owner can include in their specification, right? So we talk about don't be overprescribed, which is fine, but are there opportunities to
Yeah,
include certain things like heat recovery chiller should be a must in a
yeah,
healthcare facility,
it's
right? Like in
right. So
they should be must in a healthcare facility. Can we come to some sort of there's a standard that sort of helps owners to define a bit of prescription that, especially with the DBFM, the challenge, as you noticed, is that with a limited prescription, then there's no sort of teeth left in the end to figure out like who's going to be responsible to deliver that original target, which was intended that facility to be at.
So in the DBF model, definitely that is where you need to have that prescription on technology. And what I would say is there's a lot more shall statements of what you're required for someone to put in, because you at the end of the day, you're left managing that facility, and you want to make sure the technology is in place for you to be able to get a high performing facility, right? So the level of zoning and the prescription and so on and so forth has to be much higher there. It also requires effort upfront to make sure those sort of things are baked in to the energy model, so you can validate that energy model. For example, occupancy schedules for me is a little bit of a pet peeve, right? So they'll put in it's going to operate 12 hours a day, but which 12 hours of the day? That matters from an energy modeling standpoint. So building those sort of things in early and prescribing that, understand if that changes, you change your energy model and the energy target, and you can revise that based on how the hospital's actually operating, but actually putting in realistic targets around that is very important, right? And I would say yes. So the heat recovery, looking for effectiveness of heat recovery systems, you kind of say there's a minimum effectiveness that you want, a minimum fan efficiency, minimum targets, but don't set the targets so high. You should really be driving at overall system efficiency versus equipment efficiency and effectiveness, right? Because that is where there's that balancing act that can take place within the facility to figure out how you can make things fit. In many cases, the other thing I'd say in the master planning side of things, it is important to start to look at building orientation and so on and so forth. And in early planning stages, window sizes, for instance, have a big impact on what the overall energy consumption of our building an inpatient room is going to have, and what sort of air handling unit options you have. So there's lots of things very early on that you might prescribe, but that you want to have, but understand what those impacts are. So we've seen projects where they prescribe minimum window sizes and without fully realizing what the impact is to the overall energy efficiency. You can go from 4 air changes per hour for an inpatient room, for instance, to 6, right? And not have a lot of leeway there. So, or more than 6, for instance. So I think those are the things that Cliff was talking about that have to be studied a little bit early. And the one thing, Cliff, you can maybe speak more to this, but our understanding of the funding model is more based on the number of patients and the care that's being provided, not how efficiently your building runs. So really, ultimately, if you can spend the money up front, reduce your operating cost, you probably you have more dollars available for patient care. Right?
Absolutely. And that kind of ties my other question to Cliff, like we talked about value engineering, and then generally these hospitals, especially new construction, they come with some sort of a fixed budget that people like the ministry has in mind, and then you got to work within that and then fit your visions. There's certain things we heard that you can push a little bit of envelope, but the chances are very less. So in the end, sometimes it becomes a value engineering exercise where you value engineer the things that are not supposed to be value engineered. Like, how do you kind of see that and make sure that doesn't happen and impact is realized from operations perspective as well, that you don't end up sort of cutting things that's going to end up costing you way more than it's on our operating budget when on our capital saving few dollars. Like, how do you balance that piece around value engineering and ensuring that you get the right output and it doesn't compromise your overall performance of the healthcare facility?
Yeah, it's a good thing. And just really quickly, and Kurt, your comment is correct. I mean, we get a global budget for our facilities. So if we spend more on our facilities, that's less to patient care. If we spend less, that's more to actually delivering better care and services. So it does have an impact on the long run, and people often overlook it because capital is like an upfront cost, not a long-term operating cost, but operating it is in facilities management. We try to get away from the word value engineering because it carries so much. We're using cost rationalization framework, which is basically it just like going back to the beginning by setting your precedent, setting what you want to achieve, making sure that you involve your cost estimator in that discussion. Because again, there's a lot of people who just fall back on their behavior, which is, oh, it's a hospital, it's at this much square footage. But if you're actually starting to set some really intense goals, you want to build that into the budget. And this has been a comment I've made ever since I've been at the Ministry of Health, 20 years ago. When you get an approved budget, you get an approved budget. The trouble is that what happens is that hospitals always come back with more, ask for more, because they didn't study it in front. Now they want to do this, they want to do that. But if you do the proper planning up front and you ask for that budget, 9 times out of 10, you're going to get it approved for that. And that will include the energy aspects you're talking about. That's where you have to do the due diligence at the beginning of the project from that point of view. But then you also have to use what, again, calls cost rationalization, value engineering, where do you want to go, is that even, I'll use South Niagara as an example, even after we finished our project in terms of the RFP and we had our preferred proponent, the government and Infrastructure Ontario both asked us to come back and do value engineering, find more savings from that point of view. So, of course, they start pointing at different things in the project. But the thing is about it is we could rationalize why we're doing that and what the cost impact would be. If you took it out, this is the cost impact you're going to have on the project. So knowing the operating dollars, knowing the impact of the energy and what that means by increasing, or decreasing your energy targets from that perspective, and the overall operating cost is really important. It's just not about the capital. I'll go back to what Kurt's comment at the end. It's about the operating. And when you look at a 30-year life cycle, you look at a 60-year life cycle, our hospital sits with 100-year building components inside it from a structural point of view, then you've made that argument and you can always point to it. But don't treat value engineering as an add-on. Make it part of your overall project delivery. It supports, the rationalization of why you've asked for things, but recognizing that it's part of the process. You do it at every stage, because we will have 5 objectives that we want to include, from life safety to our operational efficiency. If anything in our project doesn't check any one of those boxes, we do ask the question, why are we doing this? If it doesn't check a box, why are we spending the money on it? So build that into the process, and build into the process the operating impacts of not doing something too.
Thanks, Cliff. Let me bring in Harry here. So thanks, Harry, for joining this afternoon. So Harry, you've been sort of working on different roles over your career, being in the design side, working through being sort of led ESCOs and even delivered ESCOs for your organization's projects. Now, your experience is working at Alberta Health Services now, managing over 200 hospitals. From your perspective now, in terms of decarbonizing the existing buildings, there's many models that are out there that owners could leverage. But again, the challenge is how do they procure these different sort of models, and what should go in the procurement so that they see a success, or they see a successful outcome of that project. So when you worked on these ESCO projects in the past or delivered a lot of these in the past, what has been your experience to ensure that the RFP that an owner wants to put in to hire these through an ESCO model or through energy and services model, what are some of the key elements you're looking within your current role to address in those RFPs so that you get a better outcome in the end, or get an outcome that delivers you that decarbonization of a healthcare facility? So maybe if you can share your experience around that and some of the past sort of lessons of anything that would be helpful for the owners to consider for their RFPs on these models.
Okay. Well, a couple comments on that. One is decarbonation is a lot harder than just purely looking at energy savings, because you've got a big boiler plant already, right? So we have not historically done a lot with purely decarbonization. It's mostly been about working to a specific payback. If the payback gets too high, finance is simply not interested, and the ESCOs get a little bit nervous because their risk is largely with the guarantee period, not with the construction process. The construction process, they got a pretty good handle on, and they can control the cost. It's much harder to control that, or the risk is higher. If they're short on year one savings, then they could be short for 15, 20 years, whatever your contract term is. So personally, we haven't really had much of an issue with saving shortfalls. And just, as full disclosure, I've worked on both sides of the fence. So some of the biggest challenges we have is just unwillingness to try new technologies because there's not familiarity with that technology. And they tend to stick to the kind of the cookie cutter measurements that they have lots of experience in and are very comfortable. Again, really focusing on the savings piece. So they do the lighting, the toilets, the BMS scheduling, the VFDs, those kind of common kind of things, right? But there is a reluctance generally to put a significant effort into really detailed recommissioning, for example. And when I did a couple ESCOs here, I really tried to push that, and it was really hard to get that going because again, there's lots of potential for saving. Generally, you can use the information that Ian shared earlier to kind of see where you're on the scale. For potential, but it takes a lot of effort, and you really don't know what you're going to get at the end, right? So, but the ESCO is required to put in a guarantee on that, and so that is really tough. And just going back to the new technologies, and there's lots of new, especially nowadays, a lot of AI kind of type technologies, but will they know what the savings are? It's hard, right? So it's easier to figure out the savings on a toilet or a light fixture. And
Sorry,
go
go
ahead. There's also a emphasis on the ESCOs to really try to deem savings if they can. So, and what that does is, so they might say, well, the water, we're only getting 10% out of the utility bills. It's hard to track. So we like to deem those savings. But what that does is put the risk back onto the owner, which is one of the reasons that an owner does an ESCO in the first place is to transfer that risk. The other really big challenging thing is the complexity involved with the contracts. Our legal folks don't have the experience in doing that. You don't do a lot, even though we've done a few ESCOs, we do very little. And they really have a tough time with the guarantee language. It's kind of unknown to them. And so that is always a long time. Because of that, those challenges, we just find it takes a long time from cradle to grave to when someone says, hey, let's do an ESCO, to the time you have a contract signed. That's a very long, tends to be a very long period of time because of the complexity. And again, it's the challenge of the legal and the finance folks. So what can we do different? Sorry. The last challenge is just through the guarantee period, especially for healthcare, like not so much maybe for offices or the K to 12. The hospitals are so dynamic with all kinds of projects going on, or operational changes, clinical operational changes, and so if there's a feeling that they're short, then they really try to push baseline adjustments, which takes a lot of time from the owner's perspective. In fact, more time from the owner's perspective than the ESCO's perspective, but it's just a lot of effort. So the suggestion is to have a guarantee strategy that's a little bit more flexible. And one of the things we did when we did ours, I set it up so even though it was like 13 years, we said as long as we can get an 18-month consistent period where we're seeing the savings and we're comfortable with savings, we'll end that requirement for the guarantee period. Because again, we know there's so much dynamics in the hospital. People are changing all the time. And it was a lot of effort. So if we know we have those savings in the first 18 months, and for us, both cases, we got it in the first 18 months, then that eliminates some work we have to do and some of the work the ESCO has to do.
Thanks, Harry. I think the one of you kind of touched on all the kind of the pain points of some of these contracts, but also you touched on the success side of this as well, because for you have been able to deliver these projects or even see these projects delivered to you successfully as well. But there's those pain points still exist in all of these projects. The two things that I think touched on last time, I think the one of the reasons that I find the success on like which could be attributed to your being involved. How important for you to sort of suggest to the owners to have somebody that actually understand the technical side of the measures and also the technical side on the M&V is important to the success of these contracts, because that sets the stage for putting out the RFP and also set the stage for ensuring that you get the right product and the right sort of M&V process in that. Like what's your sort of a take on that? How did you manage your projects with you being there and also you have a team that supports that?
Yeah, and I guess we're a little bit unique that way because we are a large organization. So I was able to, and so I got background on the design side. I've done the ESCO and I worked for the owner. So that was a bit of an advantage. And back then I was allowed to travel a little bit more. So I actually did some traveling to go to see what some other owners did, but actually physically on site. Because one of the things I discovered, and I won't mention, where, but there's things that were done on the construction side in other provinces that we can never ever get away with there in Alberta, as far as running pipes down underneath the ceiling in an active clinical corridor. Like we can never get away with that. So you see that kind of thing. But also we have I have a measurement and verification engineer who's got all the qualifications and experience. And we also try to make sure we're putting in trends, like a lot of pre-construction work we do, either installing data loggers where we can, putting trends on the BMS system, make sure we've got a computer that can store a lot of data because we want to store a lot of data, and yeah, and putting in extra points. In some cases, we put in extra points beforehand so we could track things and really try it as much as we can to figure out which savings are from which measure. Of course, the challenge with an ESCO is it's a full building. You do all the retrofits basically, mostly, all at the same time. So you don't know whether a certain measure was successful or maybe it over-delivered and something else under-delivered. But that's just the nature of the way an ESCO works, right? So, but if you can put in a bunch of sub-metering where it's possible, in training, that helps a lot.
Kurt, so you have been involved in responding to some of these recent RFPs, or even in the older ones that are being part of this ESCO models or the other financial models where the owner doesn't have the financial capacity to support some of the capital needed for these projects. What's your sort of take, and where do you think what could be added on these procurement languages that are, or RFPs that are out there, that would ensure that the success for these projects is delivered through these projects, and whether we need to be more prescriptive, rightly prescriptive, or sort of be more performance-based sort of pieces, like where some of the things could be improved, what you're seeing currently out there in the market?
So the first thing I'm going to say is probably not going to be popular with the owners on the call, but I find like once there seems to be a lot of time pressure to get these escrows out to procurement, and the procurement period is very short, which doesn't allow for the risk or the assessment or the evaluation to be able to price that properly and appropriately to put in place. So one is information. So if you're going to put that project out there and ask for decarbonization savings, and we've seen that, right? Reducing the carbon footprint and greenhouse gas emissions and improve energy efficiency with some certain targets. The people on the receiving side of that have to have information that they can work with. So utility bills, understanding floor plans with areas, things like trends for equipment. So like what I'm talking about is temperatures for their, heating water system, their chilled water system, to understand how the plant operates right now. There's a whole bunch of that information. Harry alluded to that, right? Putting in the sub-metering, buying some sub-meters, putting that in advance, and making that mini project. It'll help the facility run their facilities better, but it also, making that information available allows anyone who's bidding on that job to understand the technologies that they can implement. They can understand 24/7 cooling loads and so on and so forth within the facility, to then start to provide more of those innovative technologies beyond just lighting retrofits and washrooms and so on and so forth. If you want more innovation, you have to provide some of that information up front. And then the second thing is allowing for time. And so, where I've seen this done well is that they've gone in and gotten balancing reports. They provided the facility condition assessment reports. They provide utility bills and some of those trends of those major systems. And typically that happens when there's an embedded energy manager within the facility. They're able to, collate that information and put it out there. But that's what I would strongly advise clients to do that. The second part of that is now even Greening Health kind of points out what are the sort of targets that you could meet for that facility. What is the sort of target goals that you have? And I think those are good target values to put into the contract and set that out as the procurement, and allow someone to come back and adjust that target in their response. They would say, this is what it is, or so on and so forth. But at least that gives you a sense of where they could go with good practice. Metering for us, even on the subsystems, making that a requirement. So if someone's going to put a heat recovery chiller in, understand what's happening on both sides of that chiller. BTUs in, BTUs out. What is it displacing from your traditional chiller plant that you'd have? What is it displacing your traditional boiler plant? Looking at alternatives to domestic hot water and so on and so forth. We've seen poor experiences in the escrow side because there's a lot of finger pointing. I think Harry alluded to that, right? After the fact, you weren't operating the facility properly. That takes some of it away, because at the end of the day, if those subsystems are working well, you're seeing those results, so the benefit of that. What's happening elsewhere in the facility with changing in occupancy or use and so on and so forth, that you can offset, you can move that baseline, and you have that information to move the baseline.
Yeah, thanks. I think you kind of touched on that piece, that you want to put all the risks on the table, and risk of not sharing the data and then designing that system or solutions with not having that knowledge creates a risk for everyone. In the end, when the capital is spent, it's going to be a hard thing to fix after the capital is spent on that solution, and if it doesn't work and data doesn't support it from that perspective. So that's a key sort of, and that's what we're typically seeing with a lot of these like-for-like solutions that are coming out. In most cases, the time is a sense, and same thing with the decarbonization projects. So you got to set a right timeline for this one.
I'll add one more thing. Like, the reason you need to provide that information is just the owner pays an I don't know tax on that project, right? For everything they don't know, risk is priced. And so if you want these projects to get over the line, you've got to balance that risk on both sides of the equation.
Exactly.
So if I could add a couple more things. So two other things. One, if you don't have the internal expertise then the total value, like usually ESCO contracts are not small contracts, they're large contracts. They tend to be more for larger hospitals, so they're complex, right? So one of the things that happened, and Kirk kind of alluded to it, they come to site and they've got a certain period to finish their RFP response and sometimes a concept report later, but they come at a certain period of time. And if it's a large building, they might be there for a week, maybe, but all they get is that 1 week in the entire year. So they maybe they're there in cooling season or heating season. So they don't really have a good handle on how the building operates outside of that period, which is the challenge. And the other thing is I find is that even though we would try to communicate with our facilities folks, when they come, they're going to be asking lots of questions. They'll want lots of information. So you need to somehow spare up some time. And the challenge is they come to site, they don't really, oh, yeah, we can help them because we have contractors and consultants all the time on site, right? But it's hard often. They kind of get overwhelmed quite easily with the amount of questions that the ESCOs are asking. Because again, the ESCOs are worried about more about the guarantee period than the construction side. That's where all the risk is. So they need all that information. And for them to get it in a 2 or 3 day or 1 week or even coming back, it's really, really difficult. And again, as the owners know, like there's no such thing as an as-built drawing, right? That's just kind of an anomaly. And even a large hospital, and they're trying to look through 100 pages of drawings, and they don't know what is accurate and what is not accurate. Oh, it's a lot of work.
Thanks, Ray. Ian, I'm going to pass on to you to take maybe a couple of more minutes on the last few slides, which I know we're going to delve more into it in the forum as well.
Yeah, again, it's always key takeaways. Panel, exceptional. I thought I knew all this stuff, and I got 2 pages of notes here that are going to get folded into where we're going. A key takeaway, existing hospitals, new hospitals, performance is what matters. What we're talking about here is the end result, the outcome, and doing all the right things at the right time to get that outcome. So we like this graphic. These slides will be available for you after the session, but weaving together experience, accountability, working relationships are critical, and innovation into what delivers the high performance both now and over the life of the facility. So I love this graphic, so keep this one in mind. Next slide, please. And the next. So we talk about financing, and we're going to get into this a lot more at the forum, and I'll come to that in just a second. But to say we've got a bit of a working group. We thank Cliff for being part of that group. The group comes from both sides of the border because they're very similar issues, but everybody will recognize these. I'm not going to read these things to you, but how to pay for the work that needs to be done to achieve the savings and get the decarbonization effects that the world needs. Like, we need to get this right. So a lot of conversation about financing coming. Next slide, please. And so the last event, this is our last webinar for 2025. Our remaining event is the Greening Healthcare Forum, November the 24th. It's in person. It's at the Westin Harbour Castle Hotel in Toronto. This is where you get to see the future. You need to do your planning. We're all stuck in day-to-day things we got to get done. This is how things are unfolding. You'll hear from Anne Ford, who's the new CEO of Bright Shores, previously with William Osler, responsible for a number of the exceptionally efficient facilities we talked about at the beginning, this whole thing. So Anne's talking about how do you get things done from the C-suite is critical, but you'll also hear about that carrots and sticks aspect of project financing, the financial returns, but also regulations that are coming. So we'll have representation from New York, from the City of Toronto and their plans, from British Columbia. Regulations are coming. If we can't get this right voluntarily, it has to be gotten right. So that will work it through. That is financing and regulations. We got really interesting session on organizational alignment that you'll enjoy. What are the most energy efficient hospital organizations look like? Not the technology, the people. And successful collaboration, some really innovative, interesting approaches being taken on a regional basis, on a technology basis that can help get things done. So the forum is your chance to rub shoulders with peers. I think more work gets done, more progress is made in between the sessions than during the sessions. So if you can, make the time to be there. So the forum is coming up. And again, you'll find this reference on the under events on the Greening Healthcare website. Next slide, please. If all of this is interesting, we've got more non-member hospitals on this call than we have member hospitals, and we got a lot of our members here. But if this is of interest, and you want to consider this, becoming part of the whole greening healthcare movement and the research and the development we're doing. And next slide, get in touch with Heather Bell. She's our Director of Program and Partnership Development. Heather is not in the least bit pushy. She'll just tell you, this is what we do, this is how we do it, this is how it could work for you. If this is the right idea at the right time, let's talk about it. And if not, that's fine, we'll stay in touch. So Michael Pagel introduced this session. M&D, thank you for running a great panel discussion. I'm Ian Jarvis. I'm the Executive Director of Climate Challenge Network. Thank you all for attending today. I learned a lot. I hope you did as well. And I look forward to seeing many of you at the forum on November 24th. Thank you.